Millions of copies of Chick's Tract, This Was Your Life, have been handed out on street corners, left in public places, and distributed door to door. The plot of the cartoon contained in the tract follows a familiar Chick formula. A recently deceased man finds himself standing before God's throne for final judgment. As his entire life is reviewed on a cosmic movie screen, every sin, every missed opportunity for salvation, every moment of rebellion against God is displayed. The man desperately tries to justify himself through his good works, his church attendance, his moral behavior, but God's verdict is final, because he never accepted Jesus Christ as his personal Savior in the specific way the tract prescribes. He is condemned to eternal hellfire. On the surface, this might seem like a straightforward presentation of evangelical Christian doctrine about salvation and judgment. But when we examine the tract more closely, we find a systematic approach that discourages rather than encourages the kind of careful, thoughtful analysis that such momentous spiritual questions deserve. The most striking feature of this was, your life is how it presents its theological claims, not as interpretations or beliefs, but as objective facts equivalent to natural laws. The tract shows God's judgment as if it were a documentary rather than a theological statement. There's no acknowledgement that questions about salvation, the afterlife, or divine justice have been debated by sincere believers for centuries, or that the specific evangelical Protestant interpretation presented here represents one position among many within Christianity. The tract's narrative structure reinforces this demand for uncritical acceptance. We're not invited to consider the theological arguments, examine the biblical interpretations, or wrestle with the complex questions these doctrines raise. Instead, we're presented with a vivid, dramatic scene and told that this is simply how reality works. The man in the story doesn't get to present counterarguments or alternative interpretations. He's simply wrong, and his wrongness is demonstrated by his eternal punishment. This approach teaches readers that questioning the tract's specific theological formulations is not just mistaken, but spiritually dangerous. The message is clear: accept these particular interpretations without examination, or face the same fate as the condemned man in the story. It's a classic example of argument by intimidation, rather than persuasion through evidence and reasoning. Consider how differently this material might be presented if it genuinely encouraged critical thinking. The tract could acknowledge that Christians disagree about important questions like the nature of salvation, the requirements for divine forgiveness, or the relationship between faith and works. It could present the strongest versions of alternative viewpoints before making its case for why the evangelical position is superior. It could encourage readers to study these questions carefully, consult multiple sources, and seek wisdom from mature believers across different traditions. Instead, This Was Your Life suggests that such investigation is unnecessary and potentially harmful. The truth has been revealed in this simple comic format, and the reader's job is to accept and act, to question and examine. Throughout the tract, complex theological questions are reduced to simple either-or choices that don't reflect the actual range of positions thoughtful people hold. The condemned man represents not just one alternative to the tract's position, but apparently all alternatives lumped together into a single, silly defeated opponent. The tract suggests that anyone who doesn't accept Jesus in exactly the prescribed manner, regardless of their other beliefs, practices, or relationship with God, faces identical condemnation. This creates a straw man that combines elements from multiple different theological positions into one obviously inadequate figure. The man in the story seems to represent simultaneously the nominal Christian who relies on church attendance, the moralist who trusts in good works, the universalist who believes in divine mercy for all, and the non-Christian who follows a different religious path entirely. By combining all these different positions into one character, the tract avoids engaging seriously with any of them. It doesn't address the Catholic or Orthodox Christian, who would agree that salvation comes through Christ, but would understand the process differently. It doesn't engage with the Protestant who might emphasize different aspects of the gospel message. It doesn't consider the thoughtful non-Christian who has examined Christianity carefully and found it unconvincing for intellectual rather than moral reasons. This approach is particularly problematic because it teaches readers that they don't need to understand opposing viewpoints accurately in order to reject them. The tract implies that all alternatives to its specific position are essentially identical and can be dismissed through the same simple formula. This is the opposite of the intellectual charity and careful analysis that genuine truth-seeking requires. A more honest approach would acknowledge that people reject the tract's message for many different reasons, some of which might be quite sophisticated and deserving of serious engagement. It would present the strongest versions of alternative positions and demonstrate why. Despite their strengths, the evangelical interpretation is more compelling. Instead, the tract sets up a weak opponent and declares victory over all possible alternatives. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of This Was Your Life is its systematic use of terror tactics to coerce agreement rather than win conviction through evidence and argument. The tract's climactic scene, the condemned man's horrified realization of his fate and his desperate pleas for mercy, is designed to provoke immediate emotional capitulation rather than thoughtful consideration. The graphic depiction of eternal punishment serves not as a sobering reminder of potential consequences, but as a fear-based ultimatum: accept our message immediately or face this horrible fate. The imagery is deliberately shocking and traumatic, calculated to overwhelm the reader's rational faculties with visceral horror. The message is clear. This could be you if you don't respond correctly right now. This approach creates what psychologists call anxiety-based decision-making, where choices are driven primarily by the desire to avoid feared outcomes rather than by careful evaluation of truth claims. When someone is genuinely frightened, their capacity for critical analysis becomes severely compromised. The fight-or-flight response that terror triggers is designed for immediate physical dangers, not complex theological questions that deserve patient reflection. The tract's timing reinforces this manipulative dynamic. The reader is shown the terrifying consequences first, then immediately presented with the simple solution: accepting Jesus in the specific way prescribed. There's no time for investigation, no suggestion that such an important decision might benefit from careful study, prayer, consultation with wise counselors, or gradual understanding. The artificial urgency created by fear short-circuits the kind of thoughtful process that genuine conversion should involve. This is particularly concerning because decisions made under emotional duress rarely demonstrate the kind of understanding and commitment that would characterize authentic faith. A person who accepts Christianity primarily because they're terrified of hell hasn't necessarily engaged with the positive case for Christian belief. They've simply been frightened into submission. Such conversions are likely to be either superficial, lasting only until the fear subsides, or to create a distorted form of religiosity centered more on anxiety avoidance than spiritual growth and understanding. The tract also employs what might be called bait-and-switch tactics around the fear element. The initial invitation seems reasonable. Consider your eternal destiny. Think about what happens after death. Examine your relationship with God. These are legitimate spiritual concerns that deserve serious attention. But once the reader is engaged with these questions, they're immediately confronted with extreme imagery and ultimatums that shut down rather than encourage continued reflection. While This Was Your Life doesn't contain the kind of factual errors about history or other religions found in some Chick Tracts, it does present theological information in misleading ways that can confuse rather than educate readers about Christian doctrine and practice. The tract's portrayal of divine judgment, for instance, presents one particular evangelical Protestant understanding as if it were universally accepted Christian teaching. The idea that salvation depends entirely on a specific moment of accepting Jesus as personal Savior, with no role for ongoing spiritual development, community involvement, or growth in understanding, represents a relatively recent theological development that many Christians would not recognize as authentic to their tradition. The tract also misrepresents the relationship between faith and works in Christian theology. The condemned man's good deeds are dismissed entirely, as if Christian tradition has never seen moral behavior as evidence of spiritual health or as a natural outflow of genuine faith. This creates a false impression that Christianity teaches complete moral indifference as long as one has made the correct theological affirmation. Similarly, the Tract's treatment of church attendance and religious practice suggests that these activities are worthless, or even harmful if not accompanied by the specific conversion experience it promotes. This dismissal ignores the important role that community worship, spiritual disciplines, and religious education play in most Christian traditions, including evangelical ones. These misrepresentations are problematic because they can prevent readers from understanding authentic Christian teaching and practice. Someone whose only exposure to Christianity comes through "This Was Your Life" might conclude that the faith requires no ongoing moral effort, no community engagement, and no intellectual development, just a single moment of correct belief. This is a caricature that doesn't match the lived experience of most serious Christians and can lead to disappointment or disillusionment when reality doesn't match the Tract's oversimplified presentation. The Tract also fails to acknowledge that diversity within Christianity itself. It presents its particular evangelical Protestant interpretation as the Christian position without recognizing that Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and other Protestant denominations might understand salvation, judgment, and the requirements of faith quite differently while still being authentically Christian. Throughout "This Was Your Life," there's a complete absence of the intellectual humility that should characterize any serious engagement with ultimate questions. The Tract presents its theological interpretations with absolute certainty, as if they were mathematical proofs rather than faith-based conclusions about complex spiritual matters. This certainty is particularly striking given that the Tract deals with questions that have occupied the greatest minds in human history: the nature of God, the requirements for salvation, the reality of life after death, the problem of evil and suffering. These are not simple questions with obvious answers, yet the Tract presents them as if any intelligent person examining the evidence would inevitably reach the same conclusions. The narrative structure reinforces this lack of humility, God's judgment. In the story is presented as mechanical and obvious input the facts of the man's life, apply the correct theological formula, output the inevitable result. There's no suggestion that divine justice might be more complex, that God's mercy might operate in ways beyond human understanding, or that the ultimate fate of souls might involve factors the Tract doesn't consider. This approach teaches readers that intellectual humility is unnecessary when dealing with spiritual questions. Rather than modeling the kind of careful, tentative approach that complex theological questions deserve, the Tract suggests that complete certainty is both possible and required. This can create several problems for readers, spiritual and intellectual. Development first, it can lead to a false confidence that collapses when challenged by sophisticated alternatives. Someone who has been taught that theological questions have simple, obvious answers may be unprepared for the genuine complexity they encounter in serious academic or pastoral contexts. Second, it can create a closed-minded approach to spiritual growth. If you believe you already have complete and perfect understanding of divine truth, you have no reason to continue learning, questioning, or deepening your faith through study and experience. Third, it can make meaningful dialogue with others nearly impossible. People who hold different views aren't seen as fellow seekers who might have insights to offer, but as simply wrong and potentially dangerous. This destroys the kind of mutual respect and intellectual charity that genuine conversation requires. The Tract never acknowledges that its interpretation might be limited, that sincere and intelligent people might reasonably reach different conclusions, or that the questions it addresses might be more complex than its simple answers suggest. This absence of humility contradicts fundamental spiritual virtues like teachability and recognition of human fallibility that most religious traditions, including Christianity, consider essential. "This Was Your Life" is often distributed in contexts where readers may be particularly vulnerable to its manipulative elements during times of grief, crisis, or spiritual searching. The Tract's dramatic scenario of facing divine judgment immediately after death can be especially traumatic for people who are already dealing with mortality-related anxiety or loss. The tract's black and white presentation can be particularly harmful to people who are naturally inclined toward careful analysis and nuanced thinking. The message that questioning the tract's conclusions is spiritually dangerous can create severe cognitive dissonance for readers who recognize problems with its arguments but feel pressured to accept them anyway. Young people and new believers are especially susceptible to the tract's problematic elements. Children and teenagers often can't distinguish between the tract's theological claims, its artistic interpretations, and its emotional manipulations. They may accept the entire package uncritically, leading to spiritual development based more on fear and conformity than understanding. It's genuine faith. The tract's emphasis on immediate decision-making can pressure vulnerable readers into premature commitments they don't fully understand. The suggestion that delay might result in eternal punishment creates artificial urgency that prevents the kind of gradual, thoughtful spiritual development that most traditions recognize as healthiest. For people from other religious backgrounds, the tract's dismissive treatment of alternative viewpoints can be deeply offensive and alienating. Rather than creating genuine interest in Christianity, it may reinforce negative stereotypes about Christian narrow-mindedness and intolerance. There's a fundamental contradiction between "this was your life's apparent goal of promoting spiritual truth" and its systematic undermining of the intellectual virtues necessary for discovering truth. The tract claims to be concerned with helping readers avoid deception and find reality. Yet it employs techniques that make readers more susceptible to manipulation and less capable of careful discernment. If the tract's theological message is true and important, it deserves to be presented through honest, careful argumentation that respects readers' intelligence and spiritual autonomy. If it's false or misleading, then the manipulative techniques are being used to promote error. Either way, the tract's methods contradict its ostensible purposes. This contradiction extends to the tract's treatment of evidence and authority. Readers are encouraged to distrust their own moral intuitions, their religious traditions, their educational background, and their life experience, but to trust completely the authority of this particular tract and its specific theological interpretation. This selective skepticism teaches exactly the wrong lesson about how to evaluate spiritual claims. The tract also contradicts itself in its treatment of works and evidence. It dismisses the condemned man's good deeds as irrelevant to salvation. Yet it expects readers to accept its message based on the evidence of dramatic visual storytelling, rather than through purely spiritual revelation. If evidence and human reasoning are unreliable in spiritual matters, why should readers trust the tract's human arguments and artistic presentations? This Was Your Life represents a troubling approach to spiritual communication that prioritizes immediate emotional impact over genuine understanding, fear-based compliance over authentic conviction, and simplistic certainty over the intellectual humility that complex spiritual questions deserve. The tract's techniques: uncritical assertion, straw-man argumentation, fear-based manipulation, theological oversimplification, false certainty, and exploitation of vulnerability, are exactly the opposite of what honest spiritual inquiry requires. These methods don't serve truth. They serve the tract's desire for immediate and unquestioning acceptance of its particular theological position. The real tragedy is that these problematic methods may actually hinder, rather than help, the spiritual seeking they claim to promote. People who are manipulated into religious decisions through fear and deception may never develop the genuine understanding and authentic commitment that characterize mature faith. Those who are alienated by the tract's dishonest arguments may reject not just this particular presentation, but the entire spiritual tradition it claims to represent. If evangelical Christianity has something valuable to offer the world, and many thoughtful people believe it does, then it deserves better representation than this. Spiritual truth, if it exists, should be robust enough to withstand honest examination, generous enough to acknowledge its competitors fairly, compelling enough to win converts through evidence and argument, rather than manipulation and intimidation. The alternative to this was your life's approach isn't spiritual relativism or intellectual skepticism, but honest, careful, humble engagement with the deepest questions human beings face. This kind of approach trusts that truth can withstand scrutiny, that genuine seekers deserve honest answers, and that authentic spiritual commitment grows from understanding rather than fear.